The air on the bridge of the Fleet Command Carrier Aegis was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of ozone and self-importance. It was the scent of the new fleet, sharp, sterile, and utterly confident. Gunnery Specialist First Class Anya Sharma felt the chill of it settle deep in her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the station's environmental controls. She stood near the aft command pit, her duffel bag a lump of worn, faded canvas at her feet, a stark contrast to the gleaming chrome and holographic blue of the deck plates. Her uniform was a relic. The fabric, a deep navy blue, was softened with 1,000 washes, the creases at her elbows and knees permanent fixtures. Her rank insignia was stitched, not the modern magnetic clasps the younger officers wore. She was an analog element in a digital world, and she felt the dissonance in the sideways glances of the bridge crew. They were young, their faces smooth and unlined, their movements crisp with the certainty of those who had only ever known success in simulations. Lieutenant Kalen Vance, the ship's tactical officer, strode past her, his boots making no sound on the pressure-sensitive flooring. He paused, his eyes doing a quick, dismissive scan from her worn boots to the silver threads in the dark hair pulled back in a severe bun at her nape. He was everything she was not, young, handsome in a severe, angular way. His uniform so new it still held the memory of its packaging. "Specialist Sharma?" he asked, his tone less a question and more a diagnosis. He tapped his personal datapad, a sliver of light in his hand. "Transfer from the Epsilon Indy Depot. Logistics and Ordnance Inventory." He looked up from the pad, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Bit of a change of scenery from counting crates, I imagine. This is the tip of the spear. Try to keep up." Anya met his gaze. Her own eyes, a deep and startlingly dark brown, held no anger, no defensiveness. They were simply still. "I will, sir," she said. Her voice was quiet, lower than he expected, with a grain of texture to it, like fine sand. Vance clearly didn't know what to make of her placid response. He preferred defiance or intimidated deference. This calm neutrality was unsettling. He gestured vaguely toward the forward section of the bridge. "You've been assigned to the primary gunnery console. Station Gamma 1. The Lance." A ripple of surprise went through the nearby crew. Ensign Mei Lin, a young communications tech whose station was adjacent, looked up, her eyes wide. The Lance of Orion was the Aegis's spinal-mounted mass driver, a weapon of almost mythical power. It was a fleet killer, a planet cracker. Its operator was traditionally one of the most decorated, elite gunners in the service. Assigning a transfer from a logistics depot to the console was not just unusual, it was insulting to the very idea of the station. "The Lance." Vance's smirk tightened into a frown. "There must be a mistake in the roster. That's a post for a master gunnery sergeant with a top-tier combat rating. The orders came from Fleet Command directly," Anya stated, her voice unchanging. She picked up her duffel. "If you'll show me the station, sir." The "sir" was correct, respectful, yet it carried an odd weight. It made Vance feel like a boy playing dress-up. He bristled, turning on his heel and leading her toward the sunken pit where the weapons consoles were arranged in a semicircle facing the main view screen. A vast, curving wall that currently showed the star-dusted black of deep space. Station Gamma 1 was a throne of dark metal and unlit touch panels. It was isolated from the others, its operator given a measure of physical and systemic separation. It had its own dedicated sensor feeds, its own power conduits, its own life support. It was a microcosm of lethality. "Standard mark for interface," Vance said, his tone clipped and condescending. "It mostly runs itself. The targeting AI is the most advanced we have. It calculates relativistic kill solutions in picoseconds. Your job is to monitor the system, authorize the AI's firing solutions when commanded, and ensure the power conduits don't overload. Don't touch anything unless you're told." He gave her a pointed look. "And I mean anything." Anya set her duffel down and slid into the chair. It was cold, molded to a body larger than her own. Her hands, slender and marked with a latticework of faint, silvery scars across the knuckles, hovered over the dark console. She didn't look at the lieutenant. She looked at the blank screen, seeing not its emptiness, but the ghost of the systems that lay dormant beneath its surface. She could feel the weapon, a silent giant running the length of the ship's spine, a coiled serpent of magnetic force and potential energy. Felt familiar, felt like home. "I understand my duties, Lieutenant," she said softly. Vance lingered for a moment, waiting for more, for some sign that she was impressed or overwhelmed. He received nothing. With a huff of frustration, he turned and stalked back to his own station, leaving her in the quiet isolation of the gunnery pit. Ensign Lin chanced to look over at her, offering a small, nervous smile. Anya met her eyes and gave a slow, deliberate nod in return. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it felt like an anchor in the shifting sea of hostility. For the next hour, she sat perfectly still, her hands resting inches from the controls, a silent, unassuming statue at the heart of the Alliance's most powerful warship. The crew of the Aegis saw a misplaced clerk. They saw a mistake. They saw a ghost at the feast. They had no idea how right they were. The klaxon announcing the Admiral's arrival on the bridge was a sharp, clean sound that cut through the low hum of activity. The crew snapped to attention, their posture straightening, their focus absolute. Admiral Thorne did not walk onto the bridge. He materialized, a force of nature clad in a perfectly tailored dress uniform adorned with ribbons that told the story of a dozen campaigns. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, missed nothing. His gaze swept the bridge, assessing, cataloging. He nodded to his flag captain, then his eyes fell on the gunnery pit. They narrowed. He strode down the short flight of stairs, his boots making sharp, authoritative sounds on the metal. He stopped behind Lieutenant Vance, his presence a palpable weight. "Lieutenant." Thorne's voice was a low baritone that commanded instant obedience. "Report. All systems green, Admiral. We are on schedule to reach the Serpent's Nebula in 3 hours. Long-range scans are clear," Vance reported, his voice tight. Thorne wasn't looking at Vance. His gaze was fixed on Anya. "Who is that?" Vance felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. "Gunnery Specialist First Class Anya Sharma." "Sir." "Transfer." "I can read a name tag." "Lieutenant," Thorne said, his voice dangerously soft. "I'm asking who she is and why she is sitting at the console for the single most important weapon in this battle group." He stepped past Vance, moving to stand directly behind Anya's chair. She didn't flinch, didn't turn. Her eyes remained on the starfield displayed on the main screen. "Her file, Admiral," Thorne continued, his voice dripping with disdain as he tapped his own datapad. 10 years of active service, followed by a decade assigned to the Epsilon Indy Logistics and Ordnance Depot. Her last combat rating expired 8 years ago. Her firearm qualification is for a standard sidearm, and it's barely current. So I will ask again, what is she doing here? The question hung in the air, an indictment. The entire bridge was silent, the crew pretending to be absorbed in their tasks but listening to every word. This was more than a dressing down, it was a public dissection. Thorne leaned forward, placing his hands on the back of Anya's chair. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "Specialist Sharma." She finally turned her head slightly. "Admiral." "Tell me, Specialist," he said, his voice a low, condescending rumble. "Let's test this logistical expertise. A hypothetical. A target is moving at 0.95 light speed, Vector 77 Mark III, on an evasive course that fluctuates its temporal signature by 3.14% every 5 seconds due to localized gravitational lensing. The target's shields are reactive, meaning they harden nanoseconds after an initial energy reading. The lance fires a solid kinetic slug. How do you ensure a kill? It was a brutal, complex question, a classic command school problem designed to fail cadets. Vance smirked. He knew the textbook answer involved multivector predictive algorithms, firing a volley of sensor decoys to soften the shields, and using the ship's own gravity projectors to create a counterlensing effect. It was a symphony of tactical maneuvering. Anya was silent for a long moment. She looked not at the Admiral, but at the weapon's schematic glowing faintly on a secondary screen at her station. "You don't use the ship's sensors," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the silent room. "You slave the targeting telemetry to the main stellar observatory. They can track neutrino ghosts. The target's drive will shed them no matter how it moves. Neutrinos aren't affected by gravity lensing. You get a clean track. You don't fire at the target. You fire at where the neutrinos tell you it will be in the time it takes the slug to travel." She paused. "And you don't worry about the shields. A 2-ton slug at that velocity doesn't care about shields." The answer was so simple, so brutally direct, it was almost stupid. It bypassed all the elegant, high-tech solutions. It was the answer of a blacksmith, not a surgeon. Vance's smirk widened into a look of open disbelief. Using the stellar observatory for tactical targeting? It was unheard of. The data streams were too slow, too raw. Thorne stared at her. Her answer was not wrong, but it was archaic. It was the kind of brute force solution a bygone era of warfare might have used. It lacked finesse. It lacked the technological sophistication of the modern fleet. He straightened up, his face a mask of disappointment. "A novel theory specialist. But this is not a history lesson." He turned to the flag captain. "Captain Rask, I want this specialist reassigned to the secondary battery. At least her creativity will be contained to a plasma turret. Find me a real gunner for this post." "Admiral," a voice cut in. It was Captain Rask, a man with a reputation for quiet competence. "Her orders are flag level, sir. Codified. I can't countermand them without direct authorization from Fleet Command." Thorne's jaw clenched. To be overruled by a bureaucratic technicality on his own bridge was a profound insult. His eyes narrowed into icy slits. He looked from Rask back to Anya, who had already turned to face her console again, as if the entire conversation had been a minor distraction. "Very well," Thorne bit out, the words like chips of ice. "She stays. But she is to be monitored. Lieutenant Vance, she does not breathe without you knowing about it. She touches nothing. She authorizes nothing. The AI will handle the lance. She is a glorified circuit breaker. Is that understood?" "Crystal clear, Admiral," Vance said, a note of triumph in his voice. Thorne gave Anya one last look of utter contempt. "Don't disappoint me further, specialist," he said, before turning and ascending back to the command platform. The dismissal was complete. She had been publicly stripped of all authority, reduced to a piece of furniture at the most important station on the ship. Anya Sharma said nothing. She simply placed her hands on the console, her fingers finding their resting places in the cool indentations, and waited. The stars wheeled on, indifferent. The Serpent's Nebula was a graveyard of stars, a celestial shroud of hydrogen gas and dark matter that absorbed light and scrambled sensors. It was beautiful and treacherous. The Aegis slid into the nebula's outer wisps like a blade, its advanced sensor arrays straining against the cosmic interference. The official mission was a simple patrol, a show of force to deter pirates and smugglers who used the nebula as a hiding place. But the tension on the bridge was a low hum, a current of anxiety running just beneath the surface of professional calm. This place had a reputation. "Gravimetric distortions are off the charts, Admiral," Vance reported from the tactical station. "The nebula is playing hell with our predictive models. I'm seeing ghost signatures everywhere." "Filter them," Thorne ordered, his eyes fixed on the main view screen, which showed a swirling maelstrom of purple, red, and gold gas clouds. "Standard procedure. Calibrate for the interference." "Already on it, sir. The AI is compensating, but the signal-to-noise ratio is degrading." Anya watched the data streams flowing into her console. The raw, unfiltered feeds told a different story than the neat, sanitized display on the main screen. The ghosts Vance was seeing were not random. They were structured. They flickered in and out of existence in patterns, like predators testing the perimeter of a camp. The ship's AI, for all its power, was designed to find order in chaos. It was struggling to interpret chaos that was deliberately disguised as order. She rested her fingers on the manual override control, a physical switch protected by a clear cover. Her thumb brushed against the cool plastic. Suddenly, a piercing alarm blared through the bridge. Red alert lights flashed, bathing the crew in a hellish crimson glow. Multiple contacts. Decloaking. Ensign Lin shouted from her station, her voice high with shock. They're everywhere. Bearing 090 to 270. Close range. On the main screen, the serene nebula was suddenly filled with jagged, insectoid shapes. Wraith fighters. Dozens of them. They were small, brutally fast, and moved with an unnatural, skittering motion that defied conventional physics. They were already firing, spitting streams of plasma that splashed against the Aegis's shields in brilliant, silent bursts. Shields at 90% and holding, came the report. Point defense cannons engaging. Lines of tracer fire stitched across the screen as the ship's automated turrets tried to track the wraiths. But they were too fast, their movements too erratic. For every fighter a turret managed to lock onto, 3 more slipped through the defensive screen. Their movements are asynchronous, Vance yelled, his hands flying across his console. The AI can't predict their jinx. They're not using standard thrusters. It's some kind of localized space-time distortion drive. Manual targeting, Thorne roared. Override the AI. Gunners, fire at will. The bridge crew scrambled to comply, their simulated training a poor substitute for the visceral reality of the attack. Explosions began to rock the ship as some of the plasma bolts found their way through the flailing point defense. Shields at 70%. Aft section is taking heavy fire. Engineering reports a power fluctuation in the dorsal shield grid. The reports came in a flood of controlled panic. The Aegis, the pride of the fleet, was being swarmed, pecked apart by these gnats. Its advanced systems, its greatest strength, had become its critical weakness. They were too reliant on prediction, on patterns. The wraiths were pure chaos. And then the real crisis emerged. A new contact appeared on the long-range display, a massive signature that dwarfed the fighters. It decloaked at the edge of the nebula, a behemoth of jagged black metal and glowing red fissures. Admiral Vance's voice was barely a whisper. That's a Revenant-class dreadnought. A cold dread washed over the bridge. Revenants were the stuff of nightmares, ghost ships from the Outer Rim wars that were thought to be extinct. They carried a single primary weapon, a Chronicles torpedo launcher. A weapon that didn't just destroy a ship, it erased it from the timeline. It's charging its main weapon, Vance stated, his voice numb. I'm reading a massive energy spike from a forward emission port. Estimated charge time, 90 seconds. On the tactical display, a schematic of the Revenant appeared, with a tiny, flickering red dot on its prow. That's the emitter, Vance said. It's the only unshielded part of the ship during the charge cycle. But, sir, it's fluctuating. The aperture is less than 2 meters wide, and it's unstable. We're at maximum range for the lance. The nebula's interference. The computer gives us a 0.3% chance of hitting it. We have to try, Thorne commanded. All other concerns are secondary. Vance, get me a firing solution for the lance. Trying, sir. The AI can't get a lock. The gravimetric shear is too high. The target is shimmering in and out of the targeting window. Fire the missile batteries. Concentrate all fire on that dreadnought. Missiles are being spoofed, sir. The fighters are acting as decoys. 60 seconds. The ship shuddered violently as a coordinated volley from the fighters struck the forward shields. Shields at 40%. We're losing integrity. Panic began to fray the edges of discipline on the bridge. The young officers, so confident moments before, were now faced with an impossible problem. They were trapped. The fighters were bleeding them to death, and the executioner's axe was poised to fall. Thorne stood on his command platform, his face a grim mask, watching his magnificent ship die. His eyes scanned the chaotic bridge, and they fell once more on Station Gamma 1. On the quiet woman who sat, untouched by the panic, a still point in a turning world. Anya Sharma ignored the alarms, the shouts, the shuddering of the deck beneath her feet. The chaos of the bridge was a distant storm, an irrelevance. Her world had contracted to the glowing screens of her console and the silent hum of the weapon that lay sleeping along the ship's spine. She saw the data not as the AI saw it, a series of probabilities and error margins, but as a language. She read the flicker of the Wraith fighter's drives, the subtle energy bleed from the Revenant's charging weapon, the ebb and flow of the nebula's gravitational tides. It was all information. She watched Lieutenant Vance struggle with the automated targeting system, his movements growing more frantic. He was trying to force the system to see, but the system was blind. It was looking for a clear, stable picture that didn't exist. Anya's right hand moved, a flicker of motion too quick to be casual. Her thumb flipped up the protective cover over the manual override switch. With a decisive click, she depressed it. Across the bridge, a small light on Vance's and Thorne's command consoles switched from blue to amber. A small, almost unnoticeable change in the sea of red alerts. "What the?" Vance started. "Gamma 1 is on manual. Specialist, what are you doing?" "I did not authorize that." Anya didn't reply. Her fingers danced across the console's surface. She wasn't using the sleek, modern graphical interface. She had dropped down to the command line, to the raw, foundational code of the system. Strings of alphanumeric characters scrolled across her screen at a blinding rate. She was manually inputting targeting parameters, bypassing the trillion-dollar AI entirely. Her left hand rested on the environmental compensation touchpad, her fingers making minute, almost invisible adjustments, feeling the texture of the nebula's interference through the haptic feedback. She wasn't fighting the distortion. She was using it, folding its variables into her calculations. "Admiral, she's locked me out of the lance," Vance shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "She's inputting a firing solution by hand." Thorne's head snapped toward the gunnery pit. His face, already pale, turned a shade of thunderous purple. "Specialist Sharma, you will stand down. That is a direct order. Relinquish control of that console now." Anya's eyes were fixed on a single, wavering graph on her screen, the neutrino output from the Revenant's power core. It was a faint, almost non-existent signal, buried under layers of noise, but to her, it was as clear as a beacon. It was the target's heartbeat. She saw a flicker in the rhythm, a tiny hesitation, an exhale. Her left hand stilled. Her right hand moved to the firing stud. A low, resonant hum began to build, vibrating up through the deck plates. The sound of the lance's primary capacitors charging. "Charging," Anya said, her voice calm and quiet, yet it cut through the din of the bridge like a surgeon's scalpel. Thorne's composure finally shattered. He took a step toward the pit, his hand reaching for the sidearm at his belt as if he meant to shoot her himself. Belay that order. You can't hit that shot. It's impossible. You'll waste our only chance," he screamed, his voice raw with fury and desperation. The ship gave a deep, violent shudder, a seismic jolt that was not from an enemy weapon. A deep, guttural thump echoed through the hull. It was the sound of a 2-ton magnetic field-wrapped slug of tungsten being accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light. The lance had fired. On the main view screen, nothing changed. The Revenant was light minutes away. The slug was a ghost, traveling faster than the light that would show its passage. No impact, Vance breathed, staring at his sensor feed. She missed. All that and she. Thorne was apoplectic. He was halfway down the stairs to her station, his face a mask of pure rage. "I said belay that. You are relieved. Specialist. You are under arrest for." His words were cut off by another sound. A second thump, deeper and more resonant than the first. The ship shuddered again. The lights on the bridge flickered. The lance had fired again. Vance stared at his console, his mouth hanging open. She fired again. Sequential launch. Power core drain is at 70%. "Admiral, She routed auxiliary power from life support and inertial dampeners to recharge the capacitors in 3 seconds. Thorne stopped dead on the steps. He looked from Vance's stunned face to Anya's still form. She hadn't moved. Her hands were resting on the console, her head tilted slightly as if listening to a distant sound. He was still screaming the words in his head. "You can't hit that shot." But the truth was dawning on him, a horrifying, impossible realization. He had been screaming at her about the first shot, unaware that the second was already on its way. Time seemed to stretch. The bridge was silent save for the hum of the systems and the distant, rhythmic pounding of the Wraith fighters' weapons against the dying shields. 40 seconds of charge time left on the Revenant's weapon. 30, 20. Then, on the main view screen, at the prow of the distant, monstrous ship, a tiny pinprick of light appeared. A silent flash of brilliant white. It was impossibly small, impossibly precise. "Impact!" Ensign Lin cried out, her voice filled with awe. Direct hit on the emission port. The bridge crew erupted into a confused cheer, but it died in their throats. The Revenant was damaged, but it was still there. Its weapon was still glowing. "It's not enough," Vance said, his voice hollow. "The shot pierced the emitter, but the torpedo is still armed. It's going to—" He never finished the sentence. A second flash erupted from the same spot on the Revenant. This one was different. It was not a pinprick. It was a sun. A bloom of pure, white-hot energy that expanded outwards from the ship's core. The jagged black silhouette of the dreadnought swelled, contorted, and then vanished in a silent, blossoming nova of destruction. The second slug, fired just 3 seconds after the first, had traveled through the hole punched by its predecessor and had found the ship's reactor. A chain reaction of smaller, secondary explosions flickered within the expanding fireball, like fireflies dying in a furnace. The light from the detonation washed over the Aegis, momentarily turning the nebula's dark gases into a brilliant, incandescent cloud. The shockwave, when it finally arrived, was a gentle nudge, the last gasp of a dead god. On the bridge of the Aegis, there was only silence, a profound, absolute stillness that was heavier and more complete than any sound. The red alert lights had ceased their frantic flashing, replaced by the steady, calm blue of normal operations. The Wraith fighters, their command ship and their hive mind instantly obliterated, faltered in their attack. Their chaotic, unpredictable movements became clumsy and disorganized. Without the Revenant's influence, they were just machines. A few turned and fled back into the depths of the nebula. The others were picked off with contemptuous ease by the Aegis's now effective point defense cannons. The battle was over. Every eye on the bridge turned to Station Gamma 1. They looked at the quiet woman in the worn uniform who sat, unmoving, before her dark console. Her hands were no longer on the controls. They were resting in her lap, loosely clasped. Her breathing was slow and even. She looked as if she had just finished a simple clerical task. The silence was broken by a choked, trembling sound. It was Ensign Mei Lin. She was staring at a secondary screen at her communications post, her face pale, her eyes wide with a look of dawning, terrifying comprehension. "Admiral," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Admiral Thorne. Specialist Sharma's file." Thorne, still standing frozen on the steps, turned his head slowly to look at her. "What is it, Ensign?" he asked, his own voice hoarse. "A flagged notation just unlocked," Lin said, reading from her screen. Her voice grew stronger with each word, imbued with the weight of what she was revealing. "A security seal from the Office of Naval Intelligence. It's a service record amendment." She took a shaky breath and read. "Gunnery Specialist First Class Anya Sharma. Cross-referenced Service ID, Chimera Alpha 7. Active dates, Cycle 28 to Cycle 38. Last active combat post was not a logistics depot." Lin swallowed hard. "Sir, her last post was the Lazarus Institute on Titan. A black site psychiatric and rehabilitation facility for extreme combat fatigue and deep-spectrum operational stress." A murmur went through the bridge. The Lazarus Institute was a place spoken of only in whispers, A place where soldiers who had seen too much, done too much, were sent to be put back together, or to be quietly forgotten. Her combat rating wasn't expired, sir, Lynn continued, her voice trembling now. It was sealed, highest possible classification, and her call sign. She looked up from the screen, her eyes finding Anya's across the bridge. Her call sign during the Outer Rim secession was Anvil. The name fell into the silence of the bridge and landed with the force of a physical blow. Anvil. It wasn't a name. It was a myth. A ghost story they told cadets at the academy to scare them into paying attention in relativistic physics class. Anvil was the anonymous gunner who had single-handedly ended the secession war. The story went that in the final battle, the entire secessionist command fleet, the Ghost Fleet, had gathered at the Cygnus X-1 black hole, using its immense gravity well to shield their approach. They were poised to strike at the Alliance's core worlds. And then, one by one, they had simply died. 12 capital ships, destroyed over 3 days by a series of impossible kinetic strikes that seemed to come from nowhere, each one threading the needle through the black hole's accretion disk to strike at reactors and command bridges. No one ever claimed responsibility. No ship was ever credited with the kills. The gunner was simply known as Anvil because each shot had struck with the force and finality of a hammer blow. They had all assumed Anvil was a man, a grizzled veteran, a cybernetically enhanced prodigy. They never imagined Anvil was a quiet woman with sad eyes and scarred hands. The woman they had mocked. The woman they had dismissed as a clerk. Vance sank into his chair, his face ashen. He stared at Anya, seeing her for the first time. He saw the stillness not as passivity, but as a deep, unshakable calm forged in pressures he couldn't begin to imagine. He remembered his own condescending words. Try to keep up. The shame was so intense it was physically painful. Anya finally moved. She turned her head and looked at Thorne. Her expression was unreadable. There was no triumph, no "I told you so." There was only a profound weariness. The look of someone who had been asked to perform a miracle and was simply tired from the effort. Admiral Thorne stood motionless for a long, silent minute. The sounds of the bridge returning to normal function, quiet reports, system checks, damage control updates, were a distant murmur. He saw none of it. He saw only the woman in the gunnery pit. He saw the faint scars crisscrossing her knuckles and realized they weren't from accidents, but from years of gripping controls like these, feeling the feedback of a weapon's soul through her fingertips. He saw the threads of silver in her hair and knew they weren't from age, but from the stress of calculating trajectories that defied physics, of holding the fate of fleets in the stillness of her mind. He remembered the fury and panic in his own voice, screaming that the shot was impossible, and the memory burned him with a shame deeper than any battlefield defeat. Slowly, deliberately, he walked down the remaining steps. He didn't stop at the edge of the pit but walked right up to her station. The entire bridge crew watched, holding their breath. This was a moment that would be recounted for years. The legendary Admiral Thorne, the Iron Man of the fleet, facing the ghost they had just resurrected. He stopped directly in front of her chair. He looked down at her, at the unassuming figure who had just saved his ship, his crew, his career, his pride. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? Sorry for not believing you? Thank you for saving us from my own arrogance? The words were inadequate, insulting in their smallness. So he said nothing. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, his back going ramrod straight. He brought his right hand up in a slow, precise, and deeply formal salute. The palm was perfectly flat, the fingers held rigidly together, the thumb tucked. It was not the casual salute one might give a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a superior officer. It was the salute of a warrior acknowledging a master. It was a gesture of profound, unconditional respect, an apology and an act of fealty all in one. Anya looked at him, her dark eyes holding his for a long moment. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of her head. It was enough. The spell was broken. Lieutenant Kalen Vance, his face pale and his jaw tight with the effort of holding back a storm of emotion, pushed himself to his feet. He snapped to attention, his back so straight it looked painful, and rendered his own salute, his eyes fixed on Anya. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated awe. One by one, like a wave spreading across the bridge, the other officers followed suit. The flag captain, the helmsman, the navigators, the engineers who had come up from below decks to see what had happened. Even the young ensigns and techs, some of whom had never saluted anyone but an admiral before. They all turned to face Station Gamma 1, and they saluted. A silent, solemn, and unanimous chorus of respect for the quiet woman who had been a myth and was now a legend made real. Anya Sharma watched the salutes. She didn't smile. She didn't react beyond that one small nod. The adulation was as irrelevant to her as the scorn had been. Both were just noise, distractions from the signal. After a moment, she turned her gaze back to the main view screen, where the last embers of the Revenant's death were fading into the swirling dust and gas of the Serpent's nebula. The work was done. That was all that mattered. Hours later, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the quiet hum of a ship healing itself. Damage reports were filed, power grids were rerouted, and the log was updated with a sanitized version of events that would satisfy Fleet Command without revealing the impossible truth of what had happened. The Aegis limped out of the nebula, bruised but alive. Anya was not on the bridge. She was not in the mess hall, where the crew spoke her name, her real name and her call sign, in hushed, reverent tones. She was deep in the bowels of the ship, in the service crawlway for the Lance of Orion. It was a cavernous space, cold and cathedral-like, filled with the colossal machinery of the weapon. Massive magnetic coils, each the size of a ground transport, lined the walls of the launch tube. Power conduits as thick as a man's waist snaked across the ceiling, glowing with a faint blue internal light. The air smelled of ozone, supercooled lubricants, and the clean, sharp scent of charged metal. She wasn't required to be here. A team of engineering techs would perform the post-firing diagnostics and maintenance. But this was her ritual. This was her sanctuary. She wore a simple gray shipsuit, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing the toned, wiry muscles of her forearms. In her hand was a simple diagnostic cloth, and she was meticulously wiping down the crystalline casing of a primary focusing lens, her movements slow, practiced, and full of a quiet reverence. She was communing with the weapon, listening to its post-battle sighs and groans, feeling the residual heat in its core. Footsteps echoed in the vast space, loud in the relative silence. She didn't look up. She knew who it was. Admiral Thorne emerged from the gloom of a connecting passageway. He was alone, having shed his entourage of aides and his formal uniform jacket. He wore just his duty shirt, the sleeves rolled up in a mirror of her own. He stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude on her space. He didn't offer an apology. The salute on the bridge had been his apology, more eloquent than any words he could muster. He simply watched her for a moment as she worked, her focus absolute. "How?" he finally asked. The single word hung in the cold air between them. It wasn't a question about tactics or technology. It was a question about her. "How are you what you are?" Anya finished polishing the lens, her reflection looking back at her from its perfect, curved surface. She set the cloth aside and ran her bare hand over the cool crystal. "You were all trying to see," she said, her voice soft but echoing slightly in the chamber. She was looking at the weapon, not at him. The AI, the lieutenant, even you. You were trying to get a clear picture, to find a stable solution in the chaos. You look for patterns. You try to predict. She turned her head slightly, her gaze distant. A desperate enemy doesn't have a pattern. A cornered animal isn't predictable. It's just alive. It's feeling. The systems you use are deaf and blind to that. They read energy signatures and velocity vectors. They don't feel the tremor in the enemy captain's hand as he gives the order. They don't register the flicker of fear in a drive signature as it pushes past its limits. She looked back at the massive coil beside her. "I don't predict. I listen." The Revenants drive its weapon systems. They were screaming. The whole ship was vibrating with a kind of frantic energy. It's a language, a breath. The charge cycle wasn't perfectly stable. There was a hesitation, a tiny flutter in the energy flow just before it reached peak. The exhale, she paused, her hand stroking the cold metal of the gun. I just waited for it, and I fired. Thorne was silent for a very long time, absorbing the truth of her words. She wasn't a gunner. She was something far older, a hunter. She operated on a level of instinct and empathy that was so profound it bordered on the supernatural. She hadn't aimed at a machine. She had aimed at a moment of vulnerability, a fleeting emotional state that she could somehow perceive across light minutes of empty space. He finally understood the note in her file. Extreme combat fatigue and deep-spectrum operational stress. To live at that level of perception, to be that connected to the violence she enacted, would shatter an ordinary mind. It had almost shattered hers. The 10 years at the logistics depot hadn't been a demotion. It had been a mercy, a place to be quiet, a place to forget how to listen. Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He stepped forward and placed it on a nearby railing. It was a small, multifaceted star carved from pure, polished obsidian. It absorbed the light around it, a tiny piece of night, the obsidian star, the highest medal for valor in the Alliance, awarded only for actions of singular, strategic importance. It was the medal awarded in absentia to the gunner known only as Anvil for the victory at Cygnus X1. This belongs to you, Thorne said quietly. It has been waiting for you for a long time. He turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps receding into the darkness, leaving her alone with the ghost of her past. Anya looked at the medal, a black hole of honor sitting on the railing. She looked at its dark, unreflective surface, and then she looked back at the gleaming, powerful lines of the lance. She didn't pick the medal up. The recognition, the respect, the legends, they were burdens she had laid down long ago. Her only truth was here, in the cold steel and humming coils of the great gun. It was her partner, her confessor, her Anvil. She picked up her cloth and went back to her work, her movements calm, methodical and certain. Outside, through a thick viewport at the far end of the chamber, the light of a distant blue giant began to crest the curve of a barren moon, a silent, cosmic sunrise that glinted off the polished metal of the weapon, the forgotten metal, and the silver in her hair.